This is water, by the way. I'm impressed that so many people are interested in Kentville's history. I'm going to talk a little broader than just Kentville, but I want to just talk about a lot of the different groups that immigrated here and the tools and contributions that they did make. So I usually am talking about a particular trade. So, I'd be talking about blacksmithing or farming or shipbuilding. And this is the first time I've actually talked to a group about a whole bunch of different cultures and immigrants who came here. So if I start backing backwards or anything like that, I'll just blame it on early onset of something. I don't know. But, I had some notes here. Okay. Our region here in Nova Scotia is very culturally rich and very diverse. We had a lot of groups that came here over the years, and they all brought with them their languages, their foods, their music, their traditions, their ways of doing things, and the tools that they used. And it is quite fascinating. I'm going to look at, we're going to start with the Mi'kmaq, and then we'll go to the Acadians, and then the foreign Protestants, and then the planters, and we're just going to work our way along this table. Don't worry, I'm not going to do all the tools that are here. Just before I start that, I want to mention that there were 3 tools that were used universally around the world. And the first one was stone. Anthropologists and archaeologists have discovered that stone has been used for over 3 million years by humans or human-like people. I'm not sure of the terminology, but anyway, the first stone usage would have been a hammer, maybe a weapon. Eventually, people learned how to knap or chip away at stone to make a knife or a sharp blade. And at some point, humans realized, if we take a piece of flint and we strike it against something else, we can make a spark, and then we can make fire. So I don't have anything that's 3 million years old, but I do have the oldest tool in my museum. This is a 3,500-year-old Mi'kmaq adze. It was found on the St. John River about 100 years ago, and I'm not really sure whether it's Maliseet or whether it's Mi'kmaq, but they both were in the St. John River area. But this would have been used to do some chopping and some scraping. You could put a handle on this if you wanted to, or you could use it just by hand. And it is the earliest thing that I have. The second universal tool that everybody used was fire. And fire was a game changer. If you had fire, you could keep warm. You could see at night. If you had fire, you could cook your food. So fire was something that people prized, and if you got fire, you kept it. You had to keep it burning, because the first fire was probably discovered by somebody stumbling across lightning had struck a tree or something, what's that? Fire is something that's really important. And I have a tool here that I want to show you. This is called a spill plane. Now, matches had not been invented until the 1950s, or 1850s, sorry. Matches, they were a game changer too, but before you had matches, there were problems. For example, if you wanted to light a whale oil lamp in an upstairs bedroom, and the only source of fire you have is in your fireplace downstairs, how do you get fire up there? This is how you did it. This is called a spill plane. And if I have a board here of ice, and if I go like this, you can see spills flying out of this thing. So these are curls of wood, and now you can put this in your fireplace and carry fire upstairs to your whale oil lamp. If you have a long ways to go, you take a handful. Poor people would have their kids making spills, and then they bundle them up and go around and sell them, probably for a little tiny bit of money. But this is a spill box, and somebody in the house would have had, their chores would have involved keeping the spill box full. Somebody else would be making the kindling and so on. The other thing I wanted to mention is, I have a handful of knots here. And you might think, what good is an old knot? Well, a knot 200 years ago was a poor man's candle. If you light this knot, it will burn for 20 minutes. The pine pitch will just sort of seep out of it. It gets drawn out from the heat, and that'll burn for a long time. If you wanted to light up a room really good, take a big handful of knots and light them. The problem is there's a pile of black smoke billowing through the room, and that's why old paintings and old antiques are black and grimy, and that's because of the smoke that was in people's houses. So we're going to move on to the third tool that was used by people for 100,000 years. It's this, rope. Rope was made out of roots and vines and grass and animal hide and sinew. You could make rope in and hair. You could make rope out of anything. And rope was, it allowed you to pull things, it allowed you to lift things. Once you had rope, you could make fishnets and traps. So rope was very important. Everybody used rope. There isn't a whole lot of archaeological evidence of rope because rope rots. They have found rope in some caves in France that's 5,000 years old. And the Iceman, who was uncovered in the ice in the Alps, he had some twine with him. But you don't find 100,000-year-old rope because it just doesn't exist. It doesn't last very long. I would like to mention that rope allowed for sailing, and it allowed for nations to make bigger and bigger ships. Then they were able to explore the world. They were able to do global trade. And unfortunately, rope allowed for naval powers to become superpowers, and they sort of conquered the world and exploited, and it was, you know, so almost all technology has some good sides to it and some bad sides to it. I want to now talk about these different groups. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention something. You know how important rope is in technology or in people's lives when you hear the expressions, I'm learning the ropes, I'm tied up in knots, I'm at the end of my rope, give him enough rope and he'll hang himself, cut me some slack, I'm hanging by a thread, and I've got a knot in my stomach. That tells you that rope was really important at one point. Nobody gives a hoot about rope today. A few people might use rope when they're camping in the summertime, but it was very important. Now, the first group that was here arrived here 10,000 years ago. The Mi'kmaq came from Siberia to Alaska across the land bridge that was there. And as the last ice age was melting and the glaciers were retreating, the natives went south and they came east. And in our area, we had the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Mi'kmaq. The natives had tools that were primarily things that they found in nature. So they would use stone, they would use bone and antler and shells, and occasionally things like beaver teeth, if they're really sharp. And there were occasions when the native people had metal. There were two sources of that metal. One was when the early explorers arrived in the area of Ontario, they found these huge holes in the ground. And when they examined them, they realized that there were veins of copper protruding up out of the ground, and somebody had mined them. The copper was dug out 20 feet deep. And so there was copper here, and occasionally a meteorite would land near somebody's hunting area and they'd find it. And there have been some tools that were actually fashioned out of meteorite metal. So they did have access to some. I have a few tools here that I want to show you that are related to the Mi'kmaq. They're all post-contact. And here we have trade axes. They came in different sizes. And this is what the French and the British were bringing over here to get beaver pelts. You see there's a tiny one here and there's a large one. I think probably if you brought a pack basket with just a couple of beaver pelts, you might get a small trade axe. And if you brought a birch bark canoe loaded with beaver pelts, who knows how many you get, I don't know. But those are what the Mi'kmaq were trading for, along with pots and pans and mirrors and beads. The natives were quite excited to get things that they never had access to before. This is a harvesting knife. And an old friend of mine who died 30 years ago got it as a child. There was a group of natives that migrated every summer to the down Middleton Way along the Annapolis River, and they'd set up a little camp underneath a bunch of trees, and they would harvest, and they would make baskets, and they just lived there for the summer. And my old friend would hang out with the native kids, the Mi'kmaq children, and he'd help them do their chores. And at one point, one of the ladies said, "Hey, you've been helping us, we're going to give you your own knife." And so this is a harvesting knife for cutting roots and cutting whatever it is the natives were harvesting. This is a crooked knife, and the natives made crooked knives. We teach Boy Scouts and Girl Guides to, if you're using a jackknife, to carve away from yourself. The way this handle is configured, you can actually pull the knife towards you with a lot of confidence, and you can be very detailed in using a knife that way. They were very popular, and everybody was after a Mi'kmaq crooked knife. So then all of a sudden sailors started making them, and trappers and guides were making them, so now you don't know for sure whether the crooked knife you have was actually made by the Mi'kmaq. The last thing I'll mention as far as Mi'kmaq tools, and again, these are all have metal on them, so they're post-contact with the Europeans. But this is an eel spear, and this would have had a 12-foot long handle on it. Now, in the winter, the Mi'kmaq had a rough go of it. If you couldn't, kill a deer, you were getting hungry. And they had one source of food that they could always rely on. they watched where the eels buried themselves into the mud in the fall. And they thought, aha, we'll remember that spot. So they chopped a hole in the ice in the wintertime, and they've got this big long handle on there, and they just stabbed that in the area where the eels were, and they can harvest a lot of eels. In the summertime, they'd make a big fire on the riverbank or on the beach, and the eels would be attracted to the light at night. And they were able to then stab and catch. Eel meat is apparently very good. I've never had it, but anyway. Time to move on to the Acadians. The Acadians arrived in 1600, approximately. I'm using approximate dates because for every group that came here, they didn't come in 1 year. Some Scottish came over a 50-year period. So I'm just using approximate dates. But in 1600, they arrived in Port Royal. And they very quickly realized, okay, we've got a farm. Some of them thought they were going to be producing salt. That didn't work out. So they decided, let's farm. And they did not do what the British would do. The British would go to the uplands and they'd chop down all the trees and remove the wood and burn the brush. And then they'd have to pull out the stumps and then pull out all the rocks. And even then, when they got some soil, they had to manure it every year because upland soil is great. The nutrients are poor. The Mi'kmaq, or the Acadians, we've moved on, they took a different approach. They said, hey, there's all this fertile land down here in the tidal areas. Let's build a dam or a dike to surround that field so that the salt water can't come in anymore. And they would use logs and rocks and sods and clay, and they would make a very sturdy dike or dam to keep the water back. And they had an ingenious way of getting the fresh water out and keeping the salt water from coming in. The only problem was that land was filled with salt, and they had to wait a year or two for desalination to take place, for the rains to wash the salt out. But when the salt was gone, they had some of the best soil around. And the reason for that was for thousands of years, twice a day, the tide would come in and drop nutrients onto that soil. And by the time the Acadians were here, some of that soil was already 20 feet deep. It was alluvial soil that just had, and it was very rich in nutrients. Where am I supposed to go here now? Oh, yeah. The Acadians were down in Port Royal for 70-odd years, and then they realized, oh, we got a problem. We've diked all the land we can dike. They had running dikes along the rivers, and they had cross dikes across some of the brooks and small rivers, and they had large families. So those families had to go somewhere. So they looked east, and they looked to our area. And they came down to the Minas Basin, and they looked between, first they looked between Canning and Wolfville, and they saw that there were 5 rivers that all could be diked. So there was the Perot River, and the Habitant River, and the Canard River, the Cornwallis River, and the Gaspereau River. So they started diking all of that area. They had, and of course Grand Prairie as well. And what they basically did was the same thing they did at Annapolis Royal, and they had a really good thing going. They had orchards, and they had pasture land, and vegetables, and wheat, and they were considered the breadbasket of the Maritimes. They traded with New England. They sold to the garrison in Halifax. They sold to Louisbourg. they had they had what's what I'm looking for? They were in cahoots with the natives too, and so they were tight with the natives. They had natives were their ally. There's a word I'm looking for. But anyway, all was well until 1755, and that was the tragic event that happened. That's not what tonight's about, but anyway, the Acadians, you know, their time was up. By the way, right here in Kentville, in Chipman Corner, there was quite a few Acadians living in that area, and in the all the way down between the Cornwallis and the Canard River, there was a lot of Acadians. In New Minas, when the planters came here, they were talking about all these Acadian cellars that they were discovering. And so right here in Kentville, we were sort of surrounded by Acadians that are no more. So I have a number of things that I should show you. Oh, first of all, Acadian tools are not that rare. People think, oh, that must be rare, but there's 4 sources of Acadian tools. When the planters came here and all the other groups came here, a lot of people are amateur archaeologists, and they were out digging. Hey, Sunday afternoon, what are we going to do? Let's go dig some of those Acadian cellars. Or, you know, the people have been doing that for centuries. Another source of Acadian tools is somebody just out plowing their field. They got a 1-furrow plow and a horse pulling it, and all of a sudden, oh, there's an old diking spade. And the Acadians were here before us. That's an Acadian diking spade. When the British deported the Acadians, they burned their barns and they burned their houses and burned just about everything they could so they wouldn't come back. And out of the ashes, they were seeing, okay, there's all kinds of metal here. There's hinges and farm implements, and they thought, we don't want the Mi'kmaq getting that metal because they could use that metal to make weapons. And so they said, where can we hide this metal? So they dumped it down the well, and they thought nobody would ever look down a well. And generally people didn't, but that was the source of Acadian tools. And the 4th one is not all the Acadians were deported. In the Tantramar area, and Memramcook, and Petitcodiac, a lot of the Acadians just went up into the woods and went north and took the tools with them. And a lot of them came back within 10 or 15 years. So not all Acadians were deported. The tools that I want to show you are, first of all, these are 2 Acadian diking spades. This is what you usually see when a diking spade has been in the ground for a few hundred years. Occasionally you get lucky and you find one like this. Now I put the handle on that. The handle is long gone. But these diking spades are made differently than the groups that came later. The planters were making diking spades too, and these are a different construction. These 2 diking spades were made in Memramcook 100 years ago by a fellow by the, well, it was Arthur Bliss Saunier, and he was making, he and his father were making diking spades for 75 years. And this one is a common one that numerous people have. This is exceedingly rare. This was a child's model. There's only 2 known in existence, but Bliss or Arthur must have had a grandchild and decided, hey, I'm going to make my grandchild a diking spade. And it's made, the proportions are right, it's just the little stamp that shows his maker's mark is smaller, the rivets are smaller, the handle's smaller. This axe the axe itself is British, but the handle is French. The French always put a big knob on the end of their axe handles and their hatchet handles. And later, if you come up, just grab it with your right hand, because it's for a right-handed person, and you can swing this thing all day long and it will never slip out of your hand. So that's a telltale sign that that's French. And these went hand in hand. This doesn't have a handle on it. This was found in Grand Pré, but that's a pitchfork. You use this spade to cut sods, and the sods were living bricks that you put on your dike. And when you had to move the sod, you needed a pitchfork, and this is an Acadian pitchfork. And if you see the early sketches of people who are working the dikes, you'll always see some holding this and some holding a fork, because that's how you threw the sods around. The sods were made of black grass, and the roots went down 5 feet in the ground. So when you cut out that brick that had the green grass growing on the top, and you put it on the dike, that dike now becomes a living thing. It grows, and the grass will stay there for as long as it gets watered. The next, hold it now. Yeah, I know where we're going. There was another group of French people here, but they weren't immigrants, and that was the people at Louisbourg. To differentiate between an Acadian and the folks at Louisbourg, Acadians were here. They were after their autonomy and their independence, and they wanted to be free of government, and they wanted to do their own thing. The people at Louisbourg, they were employees of the French government. They were soldiers and administrators and sailors. And so the tools that they had all came from France. Louisbourg did have a blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith shop would have made some tools. But these are some Louisbourg tools. This is a French squaring axe. You might wonder, where does this stuff come from? Louisbourg was built in 1720, or started in the 1720s, and it was destroyed by the British and leveled in 1760, I believe. And then they rebuilt the fortress. The Canadian government rebuilt the fortress in 1960. So from 1760 to 1960, that's 200 years of archaeologists digging up on Sunday afternoons. It was just a thing that you did. So that's a French squaring axe, and it was a terrible tool to use. They didn't want to change their, if it was good enough for granddad, and it was good enough for dad, it's good enough for me. Even though the British had something called a rod axe that worked twice as good, you know, that you don't change. This is a twible, and that is a tool for doing mortise and tenon work. When you're trying to put a square socket into or a square piece of wood into a square hole, this is how they did it. British used a brace and bit and a chisel, and the French used the twible. A buttress. British used a rasp when you're putting a shoe on a horse, and the French paired it with a buttress. Just a different tool. These went out of fashion 100 years ago, and the rasp is still here, so I think the rasp must have been doing a better job. This is a French speculum. So with this, I can reach down inside a healthy cow's stomach and get some cud, and I can go over to a sick cow and put that cud in the sick cow's stomach, and the enzymes will kickstart the sick cow into getting healed. True. And this is just a French butcher's axe. Okay. Next group we want to look at, foreign Protestants. Now, people know that the Germans were foreign Protestants, but there were also Swiss and French foreign Protestants. The British back in and they came in 1750, and most of them ended up settling in the Lunenburg area. The British brought in the French Protestants because they were really nervous about the French presence at Louisbourg, the number of Acadians that were here, and they knew that the Acadians were allied with the Mi'kmaq, and they said, we got to start getting British subjects here. The British weren't too excited about coming at that point, and so they sent land agents over to Europe and said, go get anybody you can get, but they have to be Protestant, because a Protestant wouldn't fight against the King of England. They wouldn't bear arms. So that's why the Germans ended up coming to Lunenburg. Now, tool collectors always say, my gosh, we can find Acadian tools and Mi'kmaq tools, and we can find loyalists and planter tools, but how come there's no German tools? And it was discovered that the land agents that went over to Europe to bring these Protestants here were telling them, hey, don't take your stuff, the British government's going to give you everything you need. And what they were trying to do is get more people on the ship, because the more people you had coming over here, the more money you made. They were like headhunters or recruiters. So these poor people came over here, and they were given a land grant, and they were given some land and some provisions. Provisions usually involve some money, a land grant of X number of acres. You had to say that you would join the militia. You had to swear an oath of allegiance to the King of England. And they give you some seeds and a few other things. So these poor Germans that came over here, and Swiss and French, they kind of got a raw deal, because not all the promises were kept. Now, these are some German tools. This is a dingle stock, and this is a little hammer. If you were sharpening your scythe and you were British, you'd have this on your belt, and it's a whetstone, and you'd sharpen your scythe for cutting your hay or your grain. The Germans believed that you put your scythe on this little anvil, tap it with the hammer, and it would harden the metal, and it would make it very thin and very sharp. And it might have been a better way than they, because if it's really hard and really sharp, you don't have to keep, running your whetstone over it. So that dingle stock is a German tool. These are goose wing axes, and those are German tools. A few tools did come over, but those are, you see these in Ontario and you see them in Pennsylvania, but very few in Nova Scotia. Oh, I'm looking for something here. I'm looking for Leopold Langel's plan. Let's see it. I have a plane, and it's dated 1751, and the initials on there, Leopold Langel, but when you look at it, you see that the letters and numbers are all upside down and backwards. And you think, guy must have been dyslexic or something. No, he wasn't. The only person in most communities who knew how to read and write in 1750 was the priest or the minister. Education wouldn't start, public education wouldn't start for over another 100 years. And when public education did get started, there was a lot of people that were very suspect of it. They thought, what's the government doing here? I had all these kids because I wanted them to work on the farm or work in the logging camp, or, so education wasn't a thing in the 1750s. And so Leopold Langel was doing the best he could. but it's kind of interesting to see his writing. And I've seen some examples of other tools he had. He put his name on everything he owned, and the letters and numbers are all upside down and backwards. It's here somewhere, I don't see it. Okay. There's a land grant back there at the back table. It's a 1786 land grant, but the land grant was the attraction that brought people here. The deal was, you got 500 or 1,000 acres and you had to do this, this, and this, but you had to make improvements, and there were time frames that the improvements had to be made by. And so the land grant would say, you've got to maintain your dikes, you've got to make a whole bunch of new field or garden area, and you've got to build a barn and build a house and join the militia and swear an oath of allegiance. But the land grant was a big incentive for people to come. When the planters first came, well, I should say land agents went to New England in 1760 approximately. And they went to New England and they said, hey, we got this great land here. And the people from New England sent a delegation down and they checked everything out. They said, yeah, that's good, we'll come. And so they came, and the first lands they took was the land that was the Acadians had occupied. It was the best land. And so it was Cornwallis and Horton townships. And later they spread out all over the place. They were farmers and really good farmers. Yes. This is a gunter chain. It's 66 feet long. And this is what the surveyors used to survey all of the land that the planters were going to be receiving. And if you take this chain and stretch it out 66 feet long, and you go 10 chains that way and 10 chains that way, you get an acre. A road, the early roads were all 66 feet wide. So they had an easy way of very quickly calculating who got their 1,000 acres and where, or 500 acres or whatever. This is a shoe last. This is planter. Everybody had to join the militia, so everybody needed a pair of militia boots. And this was the last that they built those boots on. And you had your brown vest musket and a few other things, and not everybody was in the militia every year. He rotated so that in 1770 you're in the militia, and maybe the next year your son's in the militia, so some people got a break. But if the king and country called, you had to be ready to grab and your weapon and march. These are planter tools, Newcombs and L's. If you want to have a look at them, both of these guys finished a plane and then started another one and never finished the second one. The Newcomb one is the same. This one's finished, this one's unfinished. So people were making their own tools. And when you look at the work they did, they were master woodworkers. By the way, if we're talking about land grants, I think the first land grant in Kentville was in 1776. I found that somewhere on this. There we go. Okay, 1760s. The Scottish started coming to Nova Scotia, and the Scots were basically being kicked out. There was something called the Highland Clearances. I don't know if you've ever heard of those or not, but land was restructured, and all of a sudden people who had been on the land for 150 years were being booted out. And they had, you know, it was a pretty sobering thing to have happen to you, because you thought, well, my great-grandfather worked here. And now all of a sudden, I got to go, and they had no place to go. So they heard about this new place over here in Nova Scotia, and they started coming over for a 50-year period. Hector came in, I think, 1773. And they came to the Highlands and all over Cape Breton and the Pictou area. And one of the interesting things about the Scottish is, if you drive through Pictou, you'll see stone buildings. You'll see that they, you know, their houses are made of stone, their walls are made of stone, their buildings are made of stone. They're great stone workers. So for the Scots, I bought a few stone working tools. I have at the back. These are called feathers and wedges. I don't know if you guys have heard of these or not. But there's a wedge and two metal feathers. And what you did was you drilled holes in your stone and you pounded those in, and then you give the stone a little whack, the wedge a little whack with the hammer, and the stone will crack apart. So if you had a big piece of granite, you might have to drill 20 holes in that long piece of granite. But in the end, you just go along with your hammer and tap each of the little wedges that are here. The wedges push the feather apart, and then all of a sudden there's this big crack. I have a stone back there. I drilled a couple holes in it. It was all I could find yesterday. It wasn't frozen in the ground. And I've got some feathers and wedges in it, so at the end I'll bring that up, and we can. I couldn't find any place to. I didn't want to put it on this nice table here, so. But that's a stonemason's tool. These are stonemason's mallets and chisels, and this is what you use to dress the stone and make it look nice. It could be a gravestone or a cornerstone or a keystone, but you use this and you tap away and make the stone look finished. A tool for doing slate roofs. You can split the slate with the axe part, and this you can whack a hole in it to make a hole so you can hammer the slate onto the roof. And well, let's go to this one. It's not a tool, but it's Scottish. Before the days of fencing, the Scots had a lot of sheep, and you couldn't pen them in, because if you had 200 sheep, you had to do something else. So what they did was they took a male sheep and castrated him. Castrated a bunch of male sheep. A castrated male sheep is called a wether. And so you find a wether that is knows how to come when you call him, that is kind of maybe not aggressive, has a nice disposition, and you put the bell on him. And you never knew where your sheep were, but you knew that they were all together and in good hands. And so that's where the word bellwether sheep comes from. Okay. The Yorkshire settlers came from Yorkshire, England, 1770s. They came here because land was restructured in their area too, and they didn't have a place to farm, and they were farmers. That was all they knew. So the Yorkshire farmers came over here. They settled in Cumberland County, and in the Tantramar Marsh area, a large number of Yorkshire farmers came, and they actually bought land from the planters who were disgruntled. In Tantramar area, they weren't happy with the climate, and they weren't happy with the government that they, thought was going to be great to them. They weren't happy with Halifax. So a lot of them wanted to go back to New England and they sold their land to the Yorkshire farmers. And a lot of the farmers were also loggers. They had their land in Cumberland County, all kinds of forests there, so they turned to logging. I'll just show you a couple of logging tools here. This is an interesting one here. This is a hammer that's got the King's crown on it. And during the Napoleonic Wars and earlier and later, the British and the French navies were sending foresters and loggers and surveyors over here to cut down masts for the Royal Navies. And they were white pine trees that were fairly knot-free, and they had to be between 18 and 20 inches or something like that. That size tree was reserved for the crown. And so they would cut down the trees that they wanted, and they'd stamp it with the King's crown. And it's punishable by death if you stole a log that had the King's crown on it. When I was talking a little bit about the gunter chain, this is a landmark or a brass land, I don't know what you call it, surveying post or whatever. And it says right on here, there's a picture of the King's crown, and it says punishable 7 years imprisonment if you remove this. So you didn't mess with the King of England. So if you want to have a look at that later, that's what it says. The other marking hammers had letters on them, numbers. This one here has a 1 and a 2. It's for grading lumber. And it's got a number 1 and a number 2 and for grading. Some people use this tool. It's a race knife. You could just scratch your initials in logs, and some people use crayons later. The reason you had to mark your logs is during the winter, everybody piled their logs up on both sides of the river, and they were waiting for the spring floods to come. And at that time, everybody would throw all their logs into the river at the same time, and they'd float down the river. They'd have a long drive, and they'd send them down to the mills. And at the mill, people needed to know whose lumber was who. So they stamped it, marked it, did something to make sure they get credit for their logs. The Yorkshire people also had a lot of animals, so I brought a couple of, this is called a stifle shoe. This one's for a pony, but they came in all different sizes. And if you had a horse that had an injured leg, you would nail that type of shoe onto a particular hoof, and the horse would favor that leg, and it would have a chance to heal. So it's called a stifle shoe. This is a fleam, and it's a bloodletting tool. And every spring, there's 3 blades on here, and they're all different sizes. And every spring, they would go to their horses and tap that on the carotid artery, and they would let out a quart of blood. And they believe that you're getting rid of the stale blood, and the horse is going to run faster and pull harder all summer because you did that. And there is, what they did, after they had the little incision, they would take a hair out of the mane and do a figure-8 stitch and sew it back up. So some people, when they were buying a horse, if somebody said that horse is only 5 years old, they'd look at the neck and say, oh, gee, there's 10 fleams on that neck. The guy's lying. So, not that the used horse salesman would ever lie. The Blinkhorn Axe Factory was in Canning, and of course they made axes for 110 years. The first generation of axe makers was James Blinkhorn, and then his son Sidney took over, and then Scott at the very end. And Scott had to close in the 1960s just because of the advent of the chainsaw. And so I have a display board down here that shows, I don't know, is it there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Those are all brand new Blinkhorn axes that have never been used, and they're on a board that they put in all the hardware stores. And so Blinkhorns made a wonderful axe, and people, you know, guarded their axe. You wouldn't borrow somebody's axe years ago. It was the way they heated their house and made their living, and they took good care of their axes. I have an axe that was made by Sydney, and this was an axe that would have been made in the early 1900s. And I just brought this because you might want to come over and have a look at this one later. This one looks the very same, but this one here, it's made of foam. I rent to the movie industry sometimes. And I saw somebody being killed with my axe. This is the axe. And I asked them, I said, how did you do that? And they said, oh, we'll show you the next time when you come. So they rent this axe from me every year because it's been an ongoing show. And so the next time they returned my axe, they brought me this one too. And you can see it's, but it looks real. The other logging thing that I should point out, we're almost there, guys. This is the equivalent of a smartphone today, but it's 100 and some odd years old. On here, when I look at what's written on here, there's some entertainment. Somebody was keeping score when they were playing cards. There's also a recipe for tea biscuits on here, and there's tallying of lumber. And when you're finished with this, you can put it in your pocket and save it. Yeah. You can give it to somebody else, or you can take out your jackknife and delete it. So this was their equivalent of our smartphone. The Loyalists. Now, they came in the 1780s, and they were pretty desperate people. They didn't side with the rebels. They wanted to be loyal to the King of England, and they were being persecuted. Their lands were sometimes taken, their houses were burned, they were being persecuted. And also, the black loyalists were escaping slavery. So they came up here, and there was land grants for them, and they brought what they could with them. Some of them came with the shirts on their back. And I have some things that would have been given to them by the British government. There was a list, and the list kept changing. There were times when people got 1,000 acres, and then other times in history where they only got 300 acres or 400 acres. And sometimes, it depends on how desperate the British were to get more British and Protestant people in the province. That's sort of what it all hinged on. Flail. This is the type of hoe that they received. This is winnowing and sieving gear that they would have had when they were working with their seeds and grains. This is a hackle or a hatchel. It had a couple different names. But this is what you would run your flax through to make threads. And this one here has an awful lot of needles on it, but you would soak your flax and get it half rotted, and then you pull it through and make these threads, and then you make, basically you put it on the spinning wheel, and then you take it to your loom. Everybody in the early days had two choices for clothing, and it was wool and it was flax. Or linen. And the interesting thing is, paper, back in the 1700s, they hadn't figured out how to make paper out of wood yet. They were making paper out of linen rags. And there were rag buyers that would go around to communities and buy up all the rags they could to sell it to the paper makers. And at some points, some jurisdictions actually enacted laws saying, hey, you can't be buried in your linen, you got to be buried in wool because the paper makers weren't able to get the rags they needed. People were all being buried in their linen, and there was a shortage of paper. So it was, just that's what they did. Over here, I thought maybe there might be somebody here. I wasn't going to do this, but in the last moment, I thought we might have somebody here from Ireland or Irish descendants. I better throw in a couple of Irish things. So the Irish came over here because of the potato famines, and really, they had a rough go of it. There wasn't just one or two potato famines. I think there was 14 of them. And people had small plots of land over there. They were just eking out an existence. So when they heard there was land available over here, they came over. A lot of them switched from farming to working in the coal mines and the steel plants. So I brought a banjo, coal shovel. If there's anybody who's wanting me to include the Irish here, because they should be. And this is a lamp that they would have been using to detect methane in the mines. The only other Irish thing I have is this. It's a Newfoundland dog. It's a round piece of wood, cylindrical or cone-shaped. It's got a bunch of big fish hooks all over it. And so if you were out in your boat and you shot a goose and the goose landed in the water, you get a long rope on here, you'd fling it beyond the goose and steer it over to the goose and snag the goose and pull it in. So that's why they call it a Newfoundland dog, and obviously Newfoundland had a lot of Irish people there, so I don't know whether that's an Irish invention or not. I have a couple of things that are related to Kentville here, and so I thought I should just mention those. I brought Louis Comeau's book on Kentville because on page 35 there's a great big 3-story hotel there. And built in 1890, it's called the American House Hotel. And this saw here has the American House, Kentville, Nova Scotia, engraved on it. So I don't know whether the owner of the hotel gave it to the carpenter when he finished the hotel, or whether the carpenter gave it to the owner of the hotel. But it was a temperance hotel. So that probably meant that they didn't have much fun there, but they got a good night's sleep. So this is a wheel whacker hammer. Now, when a train pulled in, whether it's the Windsor Annapolis or the DAR, somebody had to run up and down both sides of the train and whack every wheel, because if there was a crack in the wheel, the train could move on going down to Greenwood or some Greenwood area or Kingston and derail. So they had to listen to the sound of the whack to see if it was a clear ring or whether it was a thud. And if it was they heard a thud, they'd check it out. And they might have to remove that car. So this is a wrench that was used in the Nova Scotia carriage factory. It started in 1860, and they were making carriages and sleighs right beside the Cornwallis River Bridge. And in 1900, they switched over and started making the Mackay car there. But this was a wrench that was used in the carriage factory. And the last thing, in case there's somebody that's Dutch, this is a Dutch grain shovel. We're trying to keep everybody happy. This is sort of like the United Nations of tools here.
That's true.
The last thing I just wanted to mention is Kentville was an apple town. In between Colebrook and Berwick and Port Williams and Wolfville, apple was king around here for about 100 years. And the Kentville had the Graves juice plant, and and applesauce plant. They made applesauce there and a lot of other products. This picture is really interesting because typically what we see when we look at photos of the apple industry is pictures of the apple blossoms and apple blossom festival and apple blossom or apples being harvested and apples being sprayed and put on wagons and put in barrels and loaded on the ships, but we never see where the apples end up. This photo shows, it's called Covent Gardens in London, and it was a very fancy market. And there was, I think, like 100 different people selling there. And if you look at the picture here, you can see that there's Wolfville and Port William names on the barrels. And I wouldn't be surprised if not too far away there was another booth that would have had some Kentville names on there. So that if you want to have a look at that, it's just, you know, most people never see the final destination for those apples. Thank you very much for